Hello and welcome everyone. We're just letting everybody trickle in and then we'll get started here in just a minute or two.
Is Eugene on yet?
I know he's an Eagle today. Is he joining this webinar as well?
He's one of the presenters.
Okay, let me ping him.
There's Eugene.
Hello, everyone and welcome. We have about half of our attendees here so far, so we're going to give everyone just one more moment to join and then Mark will get us started. Great, Mark, I think you can get us started. I'm not seeing folks trickle in as quickly anymore, so I think we're at critical mass.
Okay, thanks, Ashley. All right, so good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Williams, and welcome to our Housing Action Plan Guidance webinar. I'm the lead land use technical assistance planner in the Division of Local Government in DOLA, and I'll be doing most of the talking today, but I'll be joined by my colleagues Eugene Howard to discuss public engagement, by Ashley Basham to talk about grant opportunities, and our special guest star, Adam Bickford from the State Demography Office to talk about some of the new products they have to help governments complete their required action plans. So there's a lot to go over today, but here's a quick outline of what we're going to do. We'll talk about the public engagement process, which is much more robust than it is for housing needs assessments. Also, housing action plan content and things to keep in mind before, during, and after you're creating the housing action plan, how action plans can work with a regional approach, the relationship of housing action plans to housing needs assessments and also to comp plans. And then, as I just mentioned, grant funding opportunities and SDO data. And then at the end, we'll have time for Q&A. We do have a housing action plan guide on our website. It's a really helpful thing for local governments to look at and their consultants as well as they're formulating their housing action plans. Actually, the structure of this webinar tries to reflect the structure of the housing action plan guide. And so when you see something like a 2.3 or 4.2 after something that's required to be in the housing action plan, that's referring to this action plan guide. So the link is down at the bottom of the page. And also we have a quick reference guide. That guide itself is pretty long, about 80 pages. This quick reference guide is a lot shorter, so it's a good overview of what's in there. It's still being remediated. We have to follow our accessibility laws before putting anything up on our website, but it should be up any day now. Okay, so what does a housing action plan do? A housing action plan must be responsive to an accepted housing needs assessment and guides the local government in developing legislative actions, promoting regional coordination, and informing the public of local government's efforts to address housing needs in the local government's jurisdiction. So you'll notice the first thing I bolded was an accepted housing needs assessment. In this context, accepted means approved. The legislation uses the word accepted. So if you're doing an HNA, that needs to be pretty far along in the process and approved before you can do too much work on the housing action plan. It doesn't mean you can't get that work started, but you'll need to have that analysis finalized in the housing needs assessment. Okay, so who has to do a housing action plan? This part of the statute is pretty straightforward. If your community has at least 5,000 residents, you would need to do a housing action plan. You would also need to do a housing action plan if you have 1,000 or more residents, if you participated in a regional housing needs assessment or are a rural resort community. So either one of those would trigger the need for a community with 1,000 people or more to do an HAP. There is an exemption that overrides everything that I just said. If your community lost more than 1% of its population between 2010 and 2020, as shown in the census, then you would not have to do a housing action plan. I know there are some places in Colorado that have lost that much population and they're still going to do a housing action plan. So it's up to you at that point if you want to do one or not. If you're ever unsure about what you're subject to and which laws you need to do, let me turn that quiz off. We have a really cool tool on our website, and we should have the link going into the chat. We have a multi-law applicability spreadsheet and map, which will show your place on a row of all the towns and cities and counties in Colorado, with columns of exactly which laws you're subject to. There's also a graphic version of this, so you can look at a map of Colorado and zoom in to where you are. And then on the left side, you've got a lot of options for clicking all these housing and land use laws that have been passed in the last couple of years to see which ones you'll be subject to.
About 30% of everybody who's answered our quick poll really about whether or not you know if your jurisdiction is required to complete a housing action plan. But right now we're looking at 100% of people saying they do know whether or not they have to complete one. So that's great.
Clear. Next slide here, there's a lot going on this slide, so I'm not going to read all of it, but really the main takeaway is that it takes a while to do an HNA, and it takes even longer to do an HNA and a housing action plan. So if you haven't already started your housing needs assessment, or you don't have an RFP out to find a consultant, this would be a good time to do that. And the deadline for the HNAs are the end of next year. You've got longer to complete the housing action plan, though, so an additional 2 years after the HNA is due. And in fact, that point is so important that I made it my first bullet point just to repeat it at the top of this screen. It's not a bad idea to begin work well in advance of deadlines to minimize any of the problems that could be due to delays that you might not see coming. Second point here is think about coordinating your housing needs assessment with the action plan now and how that might work together and how action plans might work within the comprehensive plan. And I'll talk about that some more. But there are some differences in how you would do local and regional plans and how everything would work together in that event. And as always, if you have any questions about anything or want us to take a look at your draft, any kind of feedback, don't hesitate to contact us. We do a lot of these. Okay, a couple more things to keep in mind. While the housing action plans are due by the end, or actually the beginning of 2028, there's also a 3-year progress report that is due. So obviously 3 years after your housing action plan is approved. And that shows what progress you've made on the strategies and policies that you adopt as part of your housing action plan. So this is a good place for us to point out that coming up with a plan that really is realistic and intentional in what your community you think can get accomplished is important, because if you pick too many strategies or have too many goals, You're required to report on those after 3 years, what progress you're making. And if there's too much of them in the action plan, then your 3-year update would have to show that. So just be deliberate and strategic about what kind of housing improvements you're going to target. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Eugene to talk about public engagement. And Eugene, I'll just advance the slides when you tell me to.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. It's so nice to join everyone this morning on this really important topic. And you're going to hear a repeating theme, starting with this very first key consideration as it relates to public engagement. And that is, it's never too early to start. As Mark has indicated, there's opportunities to start early and make sure you have the benefit of time to work in your favor. And we really do think that starting early with public engagement will be really vital to the success of developing an action plan for your communities. We all know as planners that no matter how hard we work to get the word out about an activity or a plan or seeking an input, that there's always folks that don't always hear about these opportunities. So again, starting early will ensure that you have ample time to reach out to all the populations that you want to consider in the development of an action plan. So this is a great way to not only collect information to help inform the action plan, but to really make sure that the community is aware that this activity is underway. So it's an opportunity to educate the community on the needs in your communities, in building support for the actions that you all want to employ to help address the needs within your local areas. And it's also an opportunity to make sure that you have plenty of time to reach those who are most in need of this kind of work. There are a lot of vulnerable folks that tend to be difficult to reach. And so again, starting early and really giving yourself time to get the word out is one way that we can reach those sometimes difficult to reach members of our community. And no, and don't forget about, not that anyone would, but definitely we want to make sure that we're thinking about a range and a spectrum of housing to meet the needs of everyone from our youngest, the littlest folks in our communities, and up to our most senior community members. So, and everyone in between, and all the different needs in between. And as we move forward here in on the next area to really think about are examples, and the best way to communicate the needs in your community is through stories, those lived experiences that individuals face every day as it relates to seeking affordable housing or housing that meets their family or personal needs. So really think about those stories that can help those who don't quite understand the gravity of the needs of housing to see opportunities to be empathetic and to support their neighbors, even though they themselves may not be faced with the same challenges. And then thinking about infrastructure, where are there appropriate places to think about expanding housing or providing more housing choice? And really thinking about the policies that you might have in place, whether they are supportive policies into developing housing and getting the word out. Because again, thinking about the ways that you go about reaching community members is also a part of many of our policies and programs. And then thinking about some of the key requirements as it relates to engagement. Again, we mentioned this, but you'll see here on the next slide that we talk a lot about those members in your community who are at risk of displacement. Really be thinking about those folks who maybe are unable to come to a meeting through physical limitations or other needs that they might need to have fulfilled for them, accessibility into buildings or where you might be holding meetings. Of course, we always encourage folks to think about different times of day. It's often been successful to go to the places where you want to make sure you're hearing the voices of folks. So think about going to employers, during lunch hours. Think about those shift workers, because often those are the folks who face housing challenges. So let's make sure that as much as we all are able, with the resources we have available, to think about all the different members of our community and at different times, different places, piggybacking off of existing events when that's an opportunity. We've got a lot of back to school activities beginning to start up as we are now entering into back to school season. So think about partnering with those PTA groups or your schools, and joining them in their meetings so that you're not having to ask folks to come out or disrupt their personal lives more than necessary. And then just think about different ways to reach people, whether that be virtually, in person, some hybrid opportunities, maybe leaving things behind at employers or key gathering points for community members. Think food assistance locations or healthcare facilities, childcare facilities. So really the theme here is to think about being creative and thinking about all the different ways that you can reach different people. And it's also, and finally, a great idea to analyze the results and really look for opportunities to fill certain areas. So if you are seeing that you're not hearing from a particular segment of your community that you'd like to, it's okay to have targeted outreach that is really meant to reach those folks. And so think of creative, fun ways to include the theme of housing in these conversations and really truly help the community and those that you're seeking to support understand the needs that you all have. And I think from here, we're going to talk about different ways that you can go about conducting this work. And so as we move on, I think I'm going to turn this back over to Mark to talk about local versus regional plans.
And before we do that, we have a quick pulse check on the public engagement piece of this. So please feel free to answer that poll and we'll close that. It just helps us better understand where everybody's at or what we need to talk about more at the end of this presentation.
Thanks, Eugene. Sorry if I was slightly out of sync there. But let's dive back into some of the planning for local and regional HAPs, housing needs assessments, and comp plans and how they all relate to each other. So I thought it may be useful to ask questions and answer them. Do governments and regional housing needs assessments also have to participate in a regional action plan? And the answer to that is no. Local governments have discretion to choose a local or regional plan. However, just as a practical matter, no plan is solely local or regional, as all local action plans have some regional focus and vice versa. Regional housing markets are regional by nature, and the legislation reflects that. So even if you're a standalone community that did a standalone HNA and action plan, you still have to focus on some regional issues while you do those plans. How do local and regional action plans differ? So each local jurisdiction must provide the information specified by statute, and that includes public engagement, housing and zoning information and strategies, and the public hearing process at the end. However, regional plans would obviously have a more regional focus. And the format is also different than it is for local plans. And so this is a very simple example, but it's just intended to start people thinking about how they might do a regional action plan if that's what they wanted to do. And so the way that we thought of or envisioned this might happen is you've got a region, and the first chapter, so to speak, of that housing action plan would address the regional issues. And here's where the regionality of housing markets could really take effect. So if you're looking at doing housing authority or some kind of funding mechanism that would cross multiple jurisdictions, this is where you could do that. And then each of the constituent jurisdictions in that housing action plan. So you see, I've got some places here. Sorry, Rockies fans, I ran out of room. But each of these places, local governments, local cities and towns, as well as counties, they still have to do their own local action plan and have those approved at a public hearing. So this is intended to show that you could have a regional plan, and then each one of those chapters, unless you want to do it a different way, can act as the local plan. And so that local plan would go to your Board of County Commissioners or your council for a public hearing and approval. And whether that's a chapter in an overall plan or some other structure, there are multiple options to do this. This is just the way that we're throwing out as a good way to think about starting it. So a regional action plan can consider the regional housing solutions, partnerships, strategies, and other ideas. And then just don't forget that you need to do that public hearing, even if it's a local plan. And I just add one more thing, even if it's a local plan, you pull it out, it goes to the hearing, it's still part of that regional plan. And so that regional entity that coordinates the regional plan would submit the plan to DOLA. Even though your city council, for example, might approve the local plan, they don't submit it to DOLA. The regional entity submits it to DOLA. Okay, so the timing of doing an HNA and a housing action plan, if done together, we've mentioned this before, but it's an important point. The statute does say that the action plan has to be responsive to the findings of an accepted HNA. So don't get too far along with the housing action plan. Don't let it get too far ahead of the housing needs assessment process. Does the action plan have to be part of the comprehensive plan? It does. Action plans, as we know, are due by January 1st, 2028. And there's actually no statutory deadline for adding the action plan to the comp plan, but comp plans are continuously updated. And so there should be plenty of opportunities to add the action plan into the comp plan. Hopefully you can see all of this. This is some thoughts on local versus regional plans, and so I won't read all the words on here. But just to summarize, a local plan, the advantages are it's cheaper, it's nimbler because it's just your jurisdiction without having to interact with other jurisdictions, and you've got one group for your public hearing that it has to go to. On the other hand, if you do a regional plan, you've got more of a regional focus, so you could have increased benefits that way, but the trade-off is it's going to be more expensive, although that expense is shared by the governments in the region, so it could be cheaper in the long run, although the upfront costs might be a little bit higher. So at this point, we'll get into the housing action plan content and what it says directly out of the statute. There are a number of issues that are required by the statute to be addressed. So on this page, we've got 3. A summary report of local government's progress toward addressing the findings of the applicable HNA. And just to remind you, these are set up to reference the Housing Action Plan Guide with the section of the guide referenced here if you want to get more information. The second one is a description of how the action plan addresses regional housing needs in an applicable regional HNA. And last, an assessment of the effects of local government's existing zoning and density on housing development. So let's unpack all that a little bit. With the first one, the summary report, the top of that section is in bold because that's straight out of the statute. Jurisdictions are required to report the number of units built or permitted in the past 6 years if it's available. So this could include any number of, it really depends on how you've set up your permitting and tracking system. And if you haven't set up a permitting and tracking system, this would be a good time to do it. The sample table on the right is pretty standard. Just this one goes back 10 years, starting a few years ago, and tracks housing types by how many number of permits have been issued for that jurisdiction. So ADUs, triplexes, mobile homes, etc. If you haven't set the system up, now would be a good time to do it. So here's some additional options for analyzing progress on the HNA. This is continued from the previous slide. So these are not in the statute. These are suggestions on how you could go about doing this. Jurisdictions can use data to reflect on how recent development has generally aligned with the housing needs identified in the housing needs assessment. And as I mentioned, this is a good time to start laying the groundwork for your permitting tracking system. It could be done any number of ways in terms of what data is collected, how often it's collected. But yeah, this would be a good time to start doing that. So on that on that required data slide, one of the sections was for regional housing, and this is if you are in a regional housing needs assessment. Some potential ideas for tracking that would be to describe how different action plan strategies will help meet the jurisdiction's share of housing needs. Because in a regional housing needs assessment, your jurisdiction would be assigned, I guess is a word, or allocated a certain number of units that are identified for the regional need. So that's a requirement for regional HNAs. Also, you can explain how the jurisdiction will track progress towards the regional share over time. So not just now, but how would you like to do it in the next 10 to 20 years, for example? And lastly, does your jurisdiction have the land, infrastructure, and staffing capacity to accommodate its share of regional housing needs? So that's a pretty common theme, I think, is truth checking or fact checking what your capacity is for all of this and what's realistic for you to do. One of the other things from that required slide was working on existing zoning and density and doing a capacity analysis for that. You can assess how current zoning affects development unit and types and quantities that are identified by the housing needs assessment. So think zoning by use, by density, the development potential that you have in your jurisdiction. In other words, if 80% is zoned single family, 20% of the residential zoning is multifamily, how many more units do you get with that current zoning? And then a feasibility for other development types if you need to think about rezoning. How much more could you get in housing capacity through rezoning? Okay, going back to more required housing action plan content straight out of the statute. The first one, a plan to promote equitable and efficient development of housing identified in the housing needs assessment to satisfy housing needs at different income levels from extremely low to medium income households. So this would be from the HUD AMI guidelines. So extremely low is 0 to 30%, up to 120%. The second is locally appropriate goals, strategies, and actions for promoting production and preservation of affordable housing with strategies from the affordable strategies and displacement risk menus. I'll go into that in just a second because there's a lot to unpack in that bullet point. And then the third is a narrative analysis of any area the local government identifies as being at elevated risk of displacement. The HNA has a displacement risk section where each jurisdiction needs to present certain information. And so you would find what those areas are based on your displacement risk analysis from the housing needs assessment. Okay, but going back to the strategies menu, there's actually separate guidance just for this that's on our website, and you can see the link right there. There are a lot of strategies, and you'll need to select at least 4, I think, from these different strategy menus. And so rather than adding that to this presentation, because that's easily another half hour, we're going to have a separate webinar, and it's going to take place on October the 16th. And we're going to do it in a slightly different format. We do a planners peer exchange once a month where planners from around the state of Colorado participate and present with us. And so I think that would be a perfect opportunity to talk about the affordability and displacement risk menus, because I know that all the planners around the state of Colorado have probably done all of the proposed strategies on there. And so I think the format for that will be for the state to start the meeting by talking about here are the menus, here are the strategies, and now let's hear from you all and what your thoughts are on it. So if you're interested in participating in that, please let us know. Thanks. Okay, so going back to the requirement that housing must serve all incomes, you should document how the housing action plan strategies support housing needs at different income levels. And so, as I said, that's defined by AMI. It's really important to have a range of housing supported, and that HNA that you have done or are doing or will do is going to identify what your needs are for each of these income categories, and also by tenure, whether it's something that needs to be rental or ownership housing, and what the needs are for each of those two categories. And again, if you're a smaller jurisdiction or you have limited capacity, really think about what projects you think will be most beneficial to your community. Okay, this is the last slide from the required housing action plan content. First bullet, any recommended changes to local laws affecting zoning and density before the next housing action plan need to be thought through and presented. An analysis of opportunities for higher density and affordable housing within a reasonable distance of major transit stops. A narrative description of the public outreach and engagement process. I think we've already done quite a bit of that, so I'm not going to talk about public outreach anymore. And then last, describe opportunities for intergovernmental coordination for local and regional housing needs, actions along those lines. So referring back to zoning, you can use zoning and density assessment that we've already discussed to log zoning and density changes designed to increase housing production and preservation. So the first step we discussed was analyzing it, and now at the point of actually doing the zoning changes. So this could include lot sizes, permitted uses, building heights, lot coverage, density, or processes and fees. These are suggestions. If you have other approaches, then you should include those. This also is a good opportunity to engage with people who know your zoning code best, and that's probably the developers in your community, to see what they think might be a good idea to get more affordable housing. One of the requirements is an analysis of places or opportunities to increase housing near major transit stops. So this section should document the planned actions and policies that support higher density and affordable housing. What exactly a major transit stop is defined in the beginning of the statute. There's a definition section, and it's kind of a long definition, so I didn't include it here. But all of you should look at that definition, and if you have trouble finding it, let me know and I'll send it to you. So when you're formulating your action plan, just don't think about strictly, we've got a housing action plan we need to do, but think broadly about all of the plans that you may have adopted that could affect your housing action plan and feed into the analysis for doing that plan. So it could be other housing plans that you've done in the past. Of course, the comprehensive plan is a good place to look, but also transportation plans. The housing action plan guide has a really good discussion about this, and it was too long for this presentation, but that's just to let you know that that is there. This information could also include summarizing your housing policies. If you have some of these, if you don't have some of these, then these are things that you maybe could consider adopting to implement more affordable housing in your community. So inclusionary zoning, affordable housing development incentives, such as parking reductions or expedited permitting. Short-term rentals is a big one around the state, especially in the rural resort communities. And then anti-displacement measures. And there's a lot under anti-displacement. So you should attend the October 16th meeting. And then I think this is the last slide of this section. I thought twice about putting this in here because they're, as you can see, they're from Texas, and I guess Texans just like to dance. But once you get an effective action plan, hopefully the community is going to be pleased with it. And really, the intent of this slide is to say that jurisdictions are only required to meet the baseline for all the strategies that are in the plan, but the plan specifically allows communities to come up with their own strategies that the state might not have thought of. Okay, so just a few, oh, go ahead, Ashley.
Yes, we have a little bit of a poll on this last section about the baseline information. Just a pulse check here.
I think I've got 4 more slides after this, so to wrap it up, and then, all right, so after your plan is done, some important things to think about. Number 1, a public hearing is required for housing action plans. This is different from the housing needs assessment, which only requires a public meeting. So please make a note of it. The proposed action plan must be posted for at least 30 days on your website before the public hearing. And then within 60 days of local approval, submit the plan to DOLA. And if you're part of a regional housing action plan, then the regional entity would submit that to DOLA. We have a new portal, if you didn't already know, and here's the link. I think the link to that will be coming, pretty sure. So when you register for the portal to submit your housing action plan, your housing needs assessment, and other documents, just be aware that you'll need to use an official government email address, although we also accept things like quasi-governmental email addresses. So housing authorities, or if you're a council of governments that's doing the regional housing action plan, that's also okay. And then just to remind you about the 3-year report, the statute says DOLA cannot accept the 3-year progress report unless it shows adoption of the strategies and code changes identified in the plan. There's a caveat. However, if there is a good faith effort to adopt the strategies or code changes, and the jurisdiction has provided DOLA with a plan for adoption of alternative strategies or code changes, DOLA may accept the update. So this language is straight out of the statute, and the intent is you should be working on implementing the strategies and goals that you've identified you're going to do. If you haven't gotten there yet, we realize that doing these things is time consuming. And so provide an explanation of just what's going on so we can take a look at that. And then this is my last slide. We realize that we have not thought of everything. I was a local land use planner for many, many years, and no matter how many times I thought of everything when going to city council, there was always a curveball question. And so I think that that dynamic is the same here. If there's something you'd like more information on, let us know, and we might add it to our FAQ page, which is also a good place for you all to check out and see what other people have asked us. Okay, so I'm done, and now I'm going to hand it over to Ashley to talk about grants.
And before we talk a little bit more about grants, we have one more poll just about our portal. So if you could go in there, it's just a simple true false question. If you can register in the land use and housing implementation portal, even if you don't have something to upload yet. This is a little bit of a tricky question. Most of you are getting it correct so far. Let's see about maybe if we can have like 5 more people answer, we'll give away the answer here. Okay, and I'm going to end that poll now. That is actually true. So even if you don't have something to upload at this time, you can still go into the land use and housing implementation portal and register if you know that you're going to have something to upload in the future. And that's actually really helpful for us as a team to know that we have folks actually in the portal and they will be ready to upload at a future date, even if you don't have something now. And sometimes we use that as kind of a communication list as well. to our different jurisdictions. So highly recommend going in there and setting up an account in the Land Use and Housing Implementation Portal, even if you don't have something to upload right now before the statutory deadlines. So the Housing Planning Grant Program is a grant that was set up as part of all of this, as part of SB 24-174 to help fund these new items. And so the grant can actually fund newer existing HNAs, which we've all been talking a lot about HNAs, so we know what those are, newer existing housing action plans, and that's what we're talking about here today. Your housing action plan might have previously been called something else, so it could, as long as it qualifies as a housing action plan, including all this information that Mark was talking about under our baseline components, that could be considered a housing action plan, as long as at the end of that revision, it will comply with SB 24-174. And then the last portion of that being, we're flipping around here, the strategic growth and water supply elements of the comp plans, which aren't due until a later date, but those can also be funded by HPLN as well. Next slide, please. For the Housing Planning Grant Program, we have completed 2 rounds of funding. So our round 1, folks, we awarded about $900,000 to 11 projects representing 23 jurisdictions. That means that even though we only had 11 applications, there were multiple jurisdictions under one application. And regional collaboration really is encouraged where it makes sense, because it allows y'all to pool your resources where it makes sense to have a combined plan of some sort. For housing action plans, what that kind of may look like is a singular plan, but each kind of chapter of that plan has something for each jurisdiction participating. So it's kind of like a book with different chapters, but comprised all as one piece. And then our round 2 just closed in July, so we are still in the scoring process, but we expect notices of award to go out in August, which is coming up rather quickly. And we had 20 applications representing 39 jurisdictions. So as you can see, from round 1 to round 2, this is getting much more popular and folks are coming in, which we're really excited to see. But we do encourage you to come in as soon as possible if you do know that you plan to do one or more of these items, especially the housing action plans and the housing needs assessments, since those can take longer than the comp element plans. And then we are planning to have a round 3 announced in the fall of this year. We don't have an exact timeline for that yet, but once we have finalized dates, we will of course include everybody on our communication list and send an email to all the folks who are also participating in today's webinar. So don't worry, you will get an email about when those dates are available, or you can always email me if you do have questions. And then one more item here, we do have a round 3 interest survey. If you can go back just a second. Our round 3 interest survey is linked here, and maybe Mitch can put that in the chat for us too. And that interest survey is basically just telling us, hey, I'm interested in this program. Maybe if I don't apply in round 3, I might apply in a 4th round, but it allows us to add you to our communication list and to keep you updated about all the happenings around the HPLN grant program. So next slide, please. And these are just a couple of reminders here for you all. So the housing action plans under SB 24-174 are due by the January 1st of 2028. So you have some time to complete those, but there is no penalty for completing them early. So you're welcome to continue working on them up to that deadline, but you can also complete those beforehand, and you can come in for grant funding at any time as long as grant funding is still available. And as a reminder, the HPLN funding is a one-time appropriation. We don't know if we're going to have more funding in the future. So as soon as you know that your jurisdiction may need some funding for any of these items, I really recommend that you start that process as soon as you can. And you don't have to have a consultant already procured. You could be in the procurement process or planning an RFP. We're really open to working with folks at any stage in the process to make sure that you can come in and apply for funding when it makes sense for your jurisdiction. And staff are available at any point to review your statements of work, your consultant agreements, your RFPs for SB 24-174 compliance. And that is really helpful. Even if we get to the final deliverable, we can of course courtesy review those, but it's also really helpful if we review your your SOWs or your consultant agreements or your RFPs beforehand, because our TA team can make sure that you have all the components in there to create a draft that will be compliant with SB 24-174 before you get to that adoption phase. So rather than going back and redoing a lot of work that maybe you missed in the RFP process, we can catch that ahead of time and have a chat with your consultants or with you directly about what you might want to add to any of those items to make sure that at the end of this process, you will be in compliance with SB 24-174. And our HPLN FAQs are a great place to start. So those FAQs, in addition to the other FAQs that Mark mentioned earlier, these are more specific to the grant program, but they do also have a lot of great programmatic answers in there for you if you have questions about the actual HNA or the housing action plan or the comp element plans. We tried to stick some questions in there that also make sense as you're starting to conceptualize what applying for this grant might be, including the actual deliverables at the end. So I think that's it for me, and I'm going to hand it off to, I think Mark qualified him as our very special guest, Adam Bickford from the State Demographer's Office. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashley. Hi, everybody. State Demography Office, we're developing some specialized data bundles that help support the HNA guidelines document. And I want to describe a little bit about what we're envisioning, noting that things are still very much in process. These bundles that we have are going to be organized by county, given that it seems to be the most logical geography, as regions are typically collections of counties and local governments are subsets of counties. So we will provide information about a selected county, the incorporated areas in the county, including the portion of multi-county municipalities that are in a particular county, the unincorporated areas of the county as a whole, and also the individual municipalities. And we're trying to provide the information that we have available to you to help ease your analytic work. Next slide, please. So we're have to modify this. We had hoped that we would have everything together beginning in September, but it's unlikely. What's going to be happening is that we will have information from SDO generated estimates and forecasts and materials from the American Community Survey, and the release date will follow the release of the most current version of the American Community Survey, which is typically, the release is in the second week of December, which means that we will definitely have materials available beginning in the January-February period, beginning in 2026. You'll be able to find information about this on our website as this starts to develop. Next slide, please. And I'm going to pass this over on to Mark. Thank you.
Before Mark comes on to wrap us up and we start to answer some questions from the folks in our audience, I will say that this concludes our recording. So thank you for coming out to our Housing Action Plan webinar today. And I will stop the recording and we will then answer some questions from the folks who were able to attend today. Thank you so much.